Today we're going to be talking about how Aperture affects your action photos. So Aperture plays two key roles within our images. It's one of the aspects of how you control the lighting in your photo, as well as it also controls the depth of field. Let's first talk about the lighting aspect. Aperture refers to the opening on your lens, which determines the amount of light which hits your camera sensor. A really good comparison would be the pupil of our eye, which is the black part of our eye. When we're in a dark environment, our pupils dilate, which in simple terms means that they open up. That's going to allow more light in so that you can see in those darker environments. And then on the contrast, when you're in a brighter scenario, your pupils will shrink. That's exactly the same way that we use our camera lenses. So our eyes are basically just lenses. So if we're taking photos in low light, we'll want to have the most amount of light coming into our lens. So we'll want to lower our aperture, which is going to widen our aperture blades. Some lenses are going to be better than others at letting in more light, but that's all determined by the f-stop on your lens. You can figure out your f-stop by looking at the outside of your lens where it's going to say f2.8 or f4, or even some lenses go down to f1.4. The lower the f-stop on a lens like f1.2 is going to mean that it's going to be better for low light photography because it's going to allow more light into your lens. When you have a higher aperture like f11, that's going to shrink the opening on your camera, which isn't going to allow much light into your lens, which is going to make your image look darker. The control of lighting when it comes to aperture is only really one way that you can shape your photos though. Your aperture also controls your depth of field. Depth of field is the zone in front or behind your subject, which appears to be sharp when the photo is taken. So if you're trying to achieve a shallow depth of field, that means that your subject is going to be in focus, and then everything in the foreground and background is going to be blurred. And on the opposite, a deep depth of field is when more of your foreground and background are also in focus with your subject. If you want a shallow depth of field, you'll want a lower aperture like f2.8, and then if you want a deep depth of field, you're going to want an aperture at like f11. Depth of field is a great tool to use in camera because you can guide your viewer to where you want them to look just by having a blurred background and having your subject in focus, making your subject kind of pop. It's also a good thing to be aware of that the longer the focal length you use, the more blur you're going to be able to see if you're trying to achieve a shallow depth of field. Trying to balance these two things can sometimes be difficult though. Like for example, if you're trying to take a photo on a really bright sunny day and you want to have a lower aperture so that more of the environment around your subject is blurred, your photo is going to be really bright because you're letting a lot of light in. If you want to correct that though, you're either going to have to raise your shutter speed or add an ND filter. Personally, I always prefer to have an ND filter on my camera when I'm shooting in daylight, because I never really know when I want to have that creative look where I can have motion blur in my photos, because to achieve that I'm going to need a lower shutter speed, and when you lower your shutter speed and lower your aperture, you're going to have a lot of light in your photo. So that's where an ND filter comes in, because it cuts down on the light coming into your lens. That kind of leads me into my next point though, understanding aperture in motion. And figuring out what aperture you'll want when shooting subjects in motion sometimes does come down to just the day and the environment that you're shooting in. I personally found that when shooting subjects in motion, I usually like to have a lower aperture with a faster shutter speed. That's going to help my subjects stand out while freezing them in motion, and as well it's going to produce a lot of detail in my shots. I also really like it because it makes my subject pop and stand out of the scene, because it blurs the rest of the scene and just keeps my subject in focus. So if we're talking practical settings, that'd be an aperture of f2.8 and a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second. Figuring out how much detail you want to show in your environment is really going to come down to the environment that you're shooting in, as well as what you want the main focus of your shot to be about. If you're trying to tell a broader story, you might want to have a narrow aperture like f11 to showcase more of the environment around your subject. But if you really want to zero in on your subject, you're going to want a wider aperture, which is going to range from anywhere from f2.8 to f4. Like I said before, having a wider aperture is kind of my go-to because I don't usually like to showcase as much landscape. I like capturing those really hero moments and those really impactful shots, and a lot of that impact really comes from centering out my subjects. If you are looking to create more of a creative look and have motion blur in your photos, I have found that having a lower aperture as well as a slower shutter speed will produce the best results. If I'm going to be pushing for a creative look like this, I'm generally going to be starting off with my aperture at f2.8 and my shutter speed at 1/250th of a second, and I'll just kind of adjust from there, just depending on how creative I really want this look to be. Now, when it comes to the type of camera mode that I'm using most often, I'm generally shooting in manual. The reason why is because I like to have full control over both my aperture and shutter speed at the same time, because in my opinion, those two are really important when taking action photos. You'll want to control your shutter speed so that you can have those nice crisp photos, and then you want to control your aperture so that you can have a nice shallow depth of field. If you're in more of a run and gun situation and you don't want to use manual mode, I would definitely recommend using shutter priority, just because you want your subjects to be tack sharp and in focus. All right, let's recap and tie all this together. A lower aperture like f2.8 is going to allow more light into your lens, and it's also going to blur the background. And a higher aperture like f11 is going to darken your image and bring more of your scene into focus. The longer the focal length you use, the more prominent the blur is going to be around your subject when you have a lower aperture. To capture motion, a higher aperture is going to showcase more of the location you're in, and a lower aperture is going to help to emphasize your subject and make them pop from the scene because the background is going to be blurred and the foreground, so they're going to be the main focus point. If you like this video and you're looking to level up your action shots, I have a lot more videos on my channel specifically talking about action sports photography that I think you'll love. You can see more of those by checking out the channel. All right, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.